So a very warm welcome to Researcher's Desk. I have the great pleasure of welcoming Professor Ria Dunkley from the University of Glasgow. And Ria is going to be talking with us about pathways to climate equity, perspectives on advocacy and action. Ria is not only an excellent scientist, she's also a very good friend of mine and a good colleague through a university alliance where we're trying to bring European universities together to create joint education programs. So I know Ria well, and I've heard Ria talk before, and I know this is going to be super. Ria, the floor is yours. A warm welcome to Researcher's Desk. I'm going to turn my own camera off, but I am here, and I will hop in immediately if something isn't working. So don't worry, just assume everything's working fine. Welcome to Researcher's Desk.
Thank you very much, Alasdair, and it's a delight to be here. I've listened into quite a few now of the Researchers' Desk's presentations and really enjoy them. I'm always bereft if I can't get to them. So I hope I live up to the brilliant presentations that everyone has given so far and provide some food for thought today. So as Alasdair said, I'm a professor of environmental pedagogy at the University of Glasgow, but have the joy of working with Stockholm University, Kevin, Noon and Alasdair, who have sort of broadened my perspectives even further in terms of the international context in which we're going through the crisis that is kind of at the heart of all my work, the climate and ecological crisis. And it's really, my work is all about trying to bring together those global challenges into a local space in the places where I work. So now I live in Glasgow and I do all my work in a Glaswegian context mainly, but previously was in Wales and have always worked in a way that's very kind of local. And I'm going to talk today about the interconnections between the global and the local in terms of the issues that we face and also in terms of kind of the communities that we're working with. So let me just see if I can change my slides here. So just as a kind of a bit of an introduction, I wanted to kind of highlight the way that I'm approaching this. On the screen, you'll see kind of the pictures of localized flooding after a heavy downpour in Glasgow here, which affects people in terms of getting around, especially with those with mobility issues. And then the pictures of melting glaciers, which are things that we're more familiar with seeing when we think about the climate crisis. So when we think about climate equity in particular, it's often associated with far away places. So in the media or in documentaries, we will see things like the melting glaciers or arid deserts, burning forests, kind of very familiar with those kinds of images. And of course, this is because many countries in the global south, for example, and communities in places like Bangladesh, they're on the front line of climate breakdown. So it's for a very good reason that these things are being highlighted as the kind of flashbulb moments of our time that need urgently to be addressed. But one of the things that we find in terms of climate education and communication is that can be something that people in maybe highly high income countries and industrialized nations become somewhat desensitized to. They see it as something that's abstract to us, something that's in a faraway place, and it's sort of the human psyche has a bias towards addressing the things that are immediate concerns. And so in terms of effective climate communication and climate education, there's a need to bring the links into the spaces of the everyday. So I don't want to I guess, underscore the importance of that kind of communication and of the importance of thinking about the wider global context. But today I want to focus on climate equity through the lens of the local. So thinking about climate justice through the lens of the local. How does it, environmental issues, environmental justice issues, can relate to places like the towns and cities in which we live in high income countries. And I'm going to just really focus in on the Glasgow example, which is the context in which I'm working, and a project called Gallant, which I'll tell you all about in time. So just to move on. So the local context, again, this is a picture from a street in Glasgow in an area called Govan, which was previously the shipbuilding area of the city, once really affluent and now a post-industrial.
Is anyone hearing me, or is Ria frozen, or have I?
Ria is frozen.
Okay,
Yeah,
we'll just wait for her to come back online.
Yeah.
Hear me?
We can hear you again, Ria. We did
Okay.
lose you for a second.
Okay.
So
Did you lose me on this
start at the
slide?
beginning of this slide for safety.
Yeah, no problem. So I was just saying that we need to look at the local context, and I was highlighting that this is a picture that I took on a photo walk when out with a group of community members in an area called Govan, which was previously a really important area for the shipbuilding industry and steel in Glasgow in its kind of heyday. So at a point where there were lots of jobs and people flocked to the city. Now it's an area in decline where they're having basic things like the area doesn't even have a point, a bank and a point at which people can get access to their money. Basic services are being sort of drawn out of this area, and they're also affected by things like kind of flash flooding that happens when there are large and heavy downpours. So I was drawing attention to the fact that we need to look at this local picture because we're living in increasingly divisive times where the gap between the richest and the poorest countries is widening, but also the gap between the richest and the poorest areas of particular cities and towns is increasing. So in Glasgow itself, we have some of the lowest life expectancies in Europe, and in particular areas, you can be 500 meters apart, living in two different communities, one of which is affluent and the other of which isn't. And you can have a 10-year gap in life expectancies. So there are really some stark issues in terms of social justice that relate to environmental justice. So areas like Govan, for example, doesn't have a great deal of access to green space or quality green space in terms of those areas being maintained regularly. So climate change impacts are being felt kind of on our shores in the effects of kind of increased rainfall and flooding associated with that. And we need to, and we can bring this into the frame of people living locally by recognizing the effects of climate change on vulnerable UK and elsewhere. And our kind of job as researchers and educators and people who interact with policy is to think about how we might be able to consider environmental risks and the vulnerability of communities in tandem so that we can address this issue of injustice. So our university, Glasgow University, calls itself a civic university, and so it takes seriously the desire to make change locally and to impact people who need support. So given that certain communities in our city lack the resources for adaptation, we need to think then what's our role as a university in terms of enabling people to become more resilient in the face of climate crisis, and also to enable them the experiences that allow them to appreciate what's going to happen, what is happening, and how they can be involved in it if they wish to. So in terms of thinking about this, there's also the issue of the sort of abstraction that we can deal with through taking a local lens. So we can think about the here and now, the places in which we find ourselves, the local and the everyday contexts in which we can enact change and in which we can see the consequences of climate change happening. And I wanted to first just highlight a project that I've worked on a few years ago now, which we presented at COP26 to the community, called Dynamic Coast. So Dynamic Coast has had two phases. In the first phase of the project, it really was just looking at the physicality of the coast and at coastal erosion over time. So thinking about looking at historic maps for how much the coast has receded, and then thinking forward in terms of the projections for climate change and sea level rise and how much that would impact upon Scotland's coast. And there are some really dramatic results coming out of that. A lot of the golf courses along the east coast of the country, for example, are going to be dramatically affected by coastal erosion. But how I got involved in this project was my colleagues in the geography school approached me about helping to do a coastal erosion vulnerability assessment. So what we looked at doing was to create an index of vulnerability that would take into account factors like age, income, education level, all different kinds of factors to think about what would make a community and individuals essentially more vulnerable to flooding and associated events to do with storm surges along the coast of Scotland. And we created a sort of heat map along the coastline to highlight where communities would be particularly vulnerable so that we could understand the physical geography, but also we could understand what impact these kind of physical events were going to have on local people and how different people might have different ability to bounce back after coastal erosion related flooding events. So we were interested to know this, of course. I know some of the findings were very stark, and that's interesting in and of itself. But of course, knowing that this is the case doesn't address the issue. So we need in policy making who are both made aware and have a mandate to address these issues. And that, to be honest, that's something we're still working upon. We did take the results to COP26 and discuss them with decision makers. But of course, there's always trade-offs involved in resource allocations following, in terms of making decisions about the future. And so for me, sort of leaving that project behind to now talk about what we can do, because I guess I was sort of dissatisfied with the fact that we can highlight these issues, but highlighting them isn't enough. Where does that leave us then in terms of being researchers in this field and indeed educators? And if we know that the climate crisis is affecting communities with limited access to resources for adaptation, what can we do in terms of our own roles to help address some of these issues? So I sort of take this as a bit of a call for action for educators and researchers to raise what's known as ecological consciousness in my field and to do our research in ways that helps drive forward solutions and helps communities feel a sense of agency to address the issues that we're facing. So at this kind of juncture, I want to introduce just lightly the concept of eco-pedagogy, which is this kind of central to my work. So eco-pedagogy is concerned, as I've shamelessly self-quoting myself here, eco-pedagogy is concerned with generating change through what's known as a critical pedagogic process. And that emerged from the Global South, from Paulo Freire's work in the 1970s, that was concerned with social justice. But it's about bringing that lens into an environmental context, into the moment in which we're living through this times of climate crisis, and to think about what does changing what does transformative education look like in the days that we are living through. So what eco-pedagogy does, which is different to some of the concepts that you might be familiar with, like education for sustainable development or learning for sustainability, as is very popular here in Scotland. How eco-pedagogy is different is that it places a focus on understanding the wider structural issues that are at play that affect people's abilities to bounce back to issues, their abilities to get involved maybe in the climate movement itself, and their abilities to change. So often, I'm sure a lot of people on this call have felt the frustrations of not being able to feel like you can do much to change the realities of climate crisis. And so an eco-pedagogic approach would highlight the wider structural and systemic issues at play, and would seek to bring people together to think about how could you actually influence and change things as a collective. So it's recognizing that there are people who are making gains from the system as it stands, and also those who are losing or who have already lost their livelihoods. It's kind of, I guess, a slightly more bleak approach in terms of education for sustainable development, and typical approaches may emphasize kind of quick fixes, reduce, reuse, recycle kind of messages, and that's going to be the thing that gets us out. But eco-pedagogy is more about a kind of more in-depth engagement with thinking, and kind of what Paulo Freire would call a libertarian pedagogy, in that it's helping people to realize the issues that are confronting them aren't of their own fault, but they are broader societal structures and forces at play. And it puts forward that knowing that is the first step towards transformation. So it's crucial to enact changes to ensure that we can actually get traction. So eco-pedagogy.
We'll get Ria to restart when she comes back.
Is there connection?
Oh, you're back now, Ria.
Okay. Oh, I'm so sorry.
Don't worry at all. You were talking about liberating.
Okay, so I came to the university on the hope that the connection would be really good, but that was the opposite. Okay, so I was just saying that eco-pedagogy, it draws on Paulo Freire's ideas of the libertarian pedagogy, in that it's ensuring that people realize the issues that confront them are not of their own fault, but they're of a broader societal structures and forces that are at play. And it puts forth that knowing this is the first step towards transformation. So when you think about people, I guess, like Naomi Klein, who will highlight disaster capitalism and those kinds of issues, it's that kind of focus that eco-pedagogy may have. So it's more radical. And we don't stop at knowing the issues themselves. So a crucial element of being able to enact eco-pedagogy is to create change in our own everyday lives, and to
Scottish internet is amazing, isn't it? It's, that's all since Brexit. It's like this.
You hear me, Alasdair?
You're just back again. You're just back again.
Okay.
We are having a little bit. I think it's because of Brexit.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah,
Yeah.
Brexit. There's a lot to answer for. Okay, I'll continue and hopefully it works. Sometimes it sort of magically gets better. And so I was just saying that with eco-pedagogy, I've now had the opportunity to enact eco-pedagogy in communities, so outside of the university context, which is a really, really wonderful thing through a project called Gallant, which stands for Glasgow as a Living Laboratory, Accelerating Novel Transformation. And the idea of Gallant is that we work with over 65 researchers from across the university, but also with actors from outside the university, like our local council, local businesses, local organizations who are community organizing, and also members of the community themselves. So I lead the community collaboration research work stream in the Gallant project, and I'm now enacting eco-pedagogy in this broader context. So I just wanted to share this kind of broader picture of the Gallant project, because now I'm going to just focus for a few slides on what we're doing with the communities, but it's important to kind of know that it's part of this larger project where we've got scientists looking at biodiversity and climate adaptation related to flooding and vacant and derelict land and carbon sequestration. And what we're trying to do in my work package is to make all of that kind of wider context relevant and understandable to people on the ground in the city, in the areas that I showed earlier. So we're enacting eco-pedagogy in this context, and how we're going about doing that is through building meaningful relationships to begin with participants in places. So responding to the fact that a lot of the kind of literature on community engagement will be critical of academics who kind of parachute in, the parachute method it's called, where you sort of do a piece of research and then parachute out and never speak to the community members again. We wanted to avoid that and really get to know the people and the places, and to see the places as much as we could from the perspectives of those who lived there. So we started a good 2 years ago now, where we looked at the areas that the Gallant scientists were going to work in and the Scottish Index and Multiple Deprivation, and looked for kind of crossover points where we could work, which would enable us to get an insight into people living in the kind of lowest 10% of the population in terms of deprivation. And to get an insight, what we did was we took groups of people out on photo walks of the areas where we lived. So I always describe the way that we advertised for our community photo walks to engage people as being more like advertising a kind of club night in an evening, in that we went kind of door to door of barbershops and post offices and things and put flyers out. So that meant that we got a more diverse range of people coming in for these photo walks. We also offered £100 kind of thank you voucher for people to come along and be part of it, which meant, again, we got different people through the door, as I had certainly had the pleasure of working with previously. And over the course of these series of photo walks, we created a bank of over 15,000 images that were all focused on the Gallant themes, so biodiversity, flooding, active travel, in the local areas. That the people who were on the walks with us took with cameras that we gave them. So we worked with a very skilled
Interessant.
We've worked with a very skilled photography, photo voice expert on that work. And then we created maps. So you can see some of the kind of physical maps here. We had A0 maps where we got people to annotate them with photographs and also to pinpoint other things that were relevant to the project. And we ended up with such a lot that we thought the best thing we could do was to commission an illustrator to create actual illustrated maps based on the photographs people had taken of the three areas. And we've been very fortunate in that the local libraries have now taken copies of the maps. So we have thousands of maps distributed across the city where people can now navigate the city based on the Gallant themes. And there are printed kind of photo walks that people can do for themselves if they wanted to. So in that sense, the project became a bit utopian in terms of highlighting all the amazing kind of green spaces, growing spaces, bike parking, all the infrastructure that really made a difference for sustainability in places was highlighted through these photo walks. And what this did was, as well as kind of giving us the bank of photographs, really it enabled us to connect with people, to get to know people in places, to get people to trust us, that we weren't going to just leave at the end of the process, because we are working with these people over a 5-year to kind of get to know people of like 18 months at the beginning of the project. So the next element, all of this kind of work was building up to community science or citizen science projects that we're now engaged in. So many of you might be familiar with the concept of citizen science, but it provides an excellent framework, I believe, for enacting eco-pedagogy, because it focuses on valuing local knowledge and then expanding the scale and scope at which data can be collected through combining information that can really change things for people if the latter steps of kind of influencing policy, decision-making, knowledge building are taken forward. And then in a very kind of local way, the community science, citizen science project ideas, they can encourage people to gain new skills, to gain new knowledge, confidence building. There's a whole range of benefits that just come from actually being a part of this as a community member. And so we see the process as. So how do we kind of get to having community science projects? Well, we wanted to make sure that we took maybe the kind of best practice citizen science approach that we could. And that is to involve community members in every step of the process. So what we did was, after the photo walks, we interviewed people, we held other kind of celebration events with the photographs, where we constantly asked people the question, if you were doing the science that the scientists are doing in the Gallant projects, what questions would you be interested in? And in the kind of course of scraping lots of transcripts and things, we spotted that there were 77 questions in total. And we decided the best way to communicate this whole 77 questions was to put them into a booklet of emerging questions underneath the different thematic areas and for the different physical places that we were working with, and to ask people, what questions would you like to start to explore? And as a result of that, now we've got 4 projects that are very kind of in-depth. One that's focused on flooding and trees, and in particular the role of trees in alleviating flooding, but also sequestering carbon. We have a project called the Compost Collab, which is collecting compost in different sources in community gardens across the city. And we have people monitoring the compost and comparing different kinds of compost in different gardens. we have an active travel project that's route mapping active travel routes across the city, but looking at it from the perspective of the diverse user experience. So thinking about what it's like to navigate the routes with a pram, or what it's like to be on an assisted bike, or to be on an e-bike, all different kinds of experiences, so that we can get to understanding the kind of the difficulties of navigating infrastructures that the council may see as being a kind of catch-all solution. And we also have a project focusing on nature connectedness. So we're going to look at archives in an area where there are lots of community organisations involved in connecting people to nature. And we're going to interview people who are very deeply involved, and interview people who have been kind of parts of projects in the West End of the city, which is the more kind of affluent green area, and they've already got lots going on. So the way that we can help them is through helping them evaluate their practice, essentially. So we have all of this happening, and over the next sort of 2 years, we've got an app in development where all the data that comes in on these different themes will be centrally held. And we are taking people on a kind of process that I'm showing in this figure of 8 model, which actually comes from a different paper on the process of making kin with other species. So this idea that to solve the climate crisis, we actually need to get in the river and kind of see what's going on underneath the water, or connect with the non-human nature around us, and because a big part of the issue is that disconnect that we are experiencing now. So all of that is kind of to say that we have this ongoing, very active work, and we'll see the proof will be in the pudding, as we say, in terms of how effective this will be. But we're making good progress as we go. And it's not just kind of me who's saying that. I wanted to highlight, so just this Monday, we were doing a session where we're co-creating the active travel layer for the citizen science project. And these are just some of the things. Somebody who is kind of in, I think she said she was 74 and had been an environmental activist for a long time, but she felt now that she had an outlet in terms of coming along and framing things in this project, because she's just experiencing frustration in terms of nothing actually happening and the things she's observing in her everyday life. So it's making a difference for that individual. But it's also, we're getting evidence now that our work is making a difference to wider situations. So another one of the participants came along and said that the work that we'd done had influenced framings of what issues would be addressed through an infrastructure fund across the area of Govan, and that the work that we'd done in that emergent questions document had fed into that. So the feeling from this community member was that the work we were doing together was actually going to make a real tangible difference to people as well. So just hopefully everybody's heard the rest of the presentation, but I just wanted to thoughts in terms of that idea of how we can drive change from academia. I see that very much we've got a unique role to be kind of linchpins in projects like Gallant that bring together different actors in the city. So we've got kind of an enormous amount of skills and expertise and passion held in the university itself. But also we need to acknowledge that there's an awful lot of skills and knowledge and expertise held in communities. And we're only going to get to the point of solution is if we can actually figure out how to work together more effectively and to do things that create positive change, to change the lives of individuals, because it can be very difficult for people to connect us again to these abstract kind of global issues when they're experiencing things in their everyday lives that are incredibly challenging. And I guess I wanted to finish with thinking about why this kind of work is important. And sometimes it can be difficult to kind of feel that it is important alongside some of the bigger forth in university contexts, especially like the kind of technological solutions and things which are, big ticket items that can make a massive difference immediately. But I wanted to, I guess, bring the voices of some females who inspire me into the room. So here there are some great kind of people in the Govan area that I talked about, Mary Barber and Isabella Elder, who were two women who kind of organized in a local area. So Mary Barber led the rent strikes, which made a massive difference in terms of stopping kind of rogue landlords charging females left behind during the war excessive fees that would have left them homeless. And Isabella Elder gifted huge amounts of kind of public spaces to the people after the death of her shipbuilding husband in the area too. And so that to me is like two very local examples. They're on the street here on the sideboards in Govan. Two really local examples of Margaret Mead saying, "Never doubt that a small group anything that ever has." So it may feel that perhaps we're starting small, but if we don't start, we don't get anywhere. And in this vein, I always think of Rebecca Solnit's Hope in the Dark. Don't mistake a light bulb for the moon, and don't believe that the moon is useless unless we land on it. So that really says to me that we can be striving towards some bigger goal that maybe takes a long time to reach. But the important thing is that we are part of it and that we can do something within the context that we're all living. And I guess the important bit is figuring out what that something is. And I figured out what my something is. And so I'm going to keep going. And if anyone kind of wants to join me and ask questions and things, I'm very happy to explore that. So thank you very much for listening, and thanks for having me. I hope you heard me.
Thank you, Ria. We heard you really well. That was super good. Thank you for an absolutely lovely presentation and very, very inspiring. I think the whole field of eco-pedagogy is something that we need to be taking into most aspects of what we do in terms of education and research today. So it's super good.